Okay, now we begin the unit entitled Europe in the Early Middle Ages. Why? Because it's about Europe in the early Middle Ages. Thank you, I'm very creative that way. Quoting from Marvin Perry, textbook author in a Western Civ book that I use, but appropriate here nonetheless. During the early Middle Ages, around 500 to 1000, Latin Christendom was culturally far behind the two Eastern civilizations and did not catch up until the 12th century. From the 6th to the 8th century, Europeans struggled to overcome the disorder created by the breakup of the Roman Empire and the deterioration of Greco-Roman civilization. In the process, a new civilization with its own distinctive style took root. It grew out of the intermingling of Greco-Roman civilization, the Christian outlook, and Germanic traditions. That's usually the standard way of formulating the various strands that make up the Western tradition, Western civilization, European culture, the Greco-Roman influence, the Judeo-Christian influence, and the Germanic tradition. Sometimes the early Middle Ages, the period we're talking about now, and sometimes the entire Middle Ages, about 1,000 years of history, is often referred to as the Dark Ages, and it's been done that way by some for a long time. Dark Ages has, of course, a negative connotation to it, that there was sort of no light and all darkness, and that civilization was basically on the verge of going under, certainly in decline, before it finally made a comeback with the Renaissance and after. There have been plenty of authors that are around still even to this day that think that the Middle Ages were about cruelty and only. Certainly there was cruelty there, but there is in every other age as well. But cruelty and irrationality and kind of craziness, lack of organization, etc. Did they go medieval on you in the Middle Ages? Phrases that we use to actually kind of connote a certain amount of craziness. So even in our popular culture, we use the term medieval in a negative way. One extremely good book on this question by a historian named William Manchester, most known for a biography he wrote about Douglas MacArthur, totally different subject, called A World Lit Only by Fire, the Medieval Mind and the Renaissance. He goes off on the Middle Ages. This is my single favorite quote from a very good book. Modern historians have abandoned that phrase, the Dark Ages. One of them writes, quote, because of the unacceptable value judgment it implies, unquote. Very little is clear about that dim era. This author goes on to say, intellectual life had vanished from Europe. Literacy was scorned. It is undeniable that most of what is known about the period is unlovely. The portrait that emerges is a melange of incessant warfare, corruption, lawlessness, obsession with strange myths, and an almost impenetrable mindlessness. I love the last two words, impenetrable mindlessness. So Professor Manchester doesn't think much of the Middle Ages, and he does believe the phrase Dark Ages should apply. A more recent book, by a bit, takes the other side. They're not writing about the exact same subject, but Rodney Stark is clearly on the other side in saying that the Dark Ages never happened. That was an era, the early Middle Ages, the entire Middle Ages, of remarkable progress and innovation that included the invention of capitalism. So there's still a lot to disagree about over this. As good as William Manchester's book is, it's really a page-turner. It's difficult to put it down. I don't think he's right in the end about this, and he's committing the sin of presentism by expecting people in the Middle Ages to sort of be like us today, which was impossible. Nonetheless, it makes for spicy reading, and there are some truths in it about the Middle Ages, so it's worth reading. The rough Germanic culture of the early Middle Ages. Now, in this sense, Manchester had a point. And so this is part of the reason why I'd say that he wasn't wrong about everything. Norman Cantor, who I've quoted many times before, this time from a different book, I've been quoting antiquity through certain units in this class, but this is his classic Civilization of the Middle Ages. Writes, large numbers had been assimilated into Roman culture, but it appears evident the other Germanic peoples had been little affected by Romanization and were fierce, ignorant, and barbarian in every sense of the word. Cantor, at least with regard to the early Middle Ages, does agree with Manchester. I don't think he agrees with him about the rest of the Middle Ages, however. He goes on to talk about how they had no concept of a state, personal loyalties and blood ties to family and kin, sort of, were the only real loyalties. So there wasn't sort of a higher loyalty to a bigger group. Certainly no concept of an impersonal state. If there was some loyalty to a state, it was you're loyal personally to a king, but not to an abstract concept like the state. Manchester again says the people in the Middle Ages, Europeans, did not think of a brawl resulting in homicide as murder. Everyday violence was shocking, and that is true too. It's just that that's true in a lot of places in the world in the Middle Ages. The law was about decreasing violence and homicide. Blood feud, as is often called, or trial by ordeal, sometimes used. This is another part of the way Europeans did things in the Middle Ages that Manchester finds totally irrational, and they are fun to learn about because they're so crazy. But there are a number of types of trials by ordeal, trial by fire, that are just loony to us today because they have nothing to do with evidence and trying to, by our own standards of evidence, trying to get at who actually committed a crime. So you throw them in the water, and if the defendant sinks, he's innocent. If he floats, he's guilty. You don't have to think about that for very long to see how funny it actually is. Blood feud meant back and forth kind of feuding between clans and families, sort of like the famous American feud in much more recent times, of course, between the Hatfields and the McCoys. So blood feud were these sort of family, generational, intergenerational conflicts, and the Germanic tribes largely made up the dominant force in the West right after the fall of the Roman Empire in the Middle Ages, early Middle Ages. They had a practical way of dealing with homicide, at least to stop the blood feud version of homicide. And that is, instead of punishing perpetrators, it was oftentimes hard to find who the bad guy was anyway, since both families were retaliating back and forth and had been for so long. But they would try to go to one of the families or both and kind of, say, what's it going to take to get you to stop, making violence on this other family, and maybe pay them to stop doing it. Do something in their interests, to get them to stop doing it. So it wasn't so much about punishing murderers as it was finding a way to dial down the long-term conflict, because it was the long-term conflict that was the bigger problem. One of the Germanic groups or Germanic tribes that had been part of overrunning the Roman Empire were the Franks. Although at the time, nobody knew that the Franks were going to go on to be the powerful group, at least in Western Europe. But they emerged on the other side of the Roman Empire within 100 years or so after its fall as the dominant force in what's now, as you can see on the map here on the left, France, and even into the Low Countries and parts of Germany, the western half of Germany, practically. So the Franks first united under a king called Clovis, conquered most of France. Gaul was known then, and through two successive dynasties, they expanded and built an empire that comprised much of northern, western, and central Europe. So after the fall of Rome, this was sort of the first successful effort, at least for the time being, to re-centralize power again, in one empire under one monarchy, one government. The powers of the Franks as a kingdom, as monarchs, broke down through problems of succession and through foreign invasion. So they divided up their own territory by inheritance patterns and rights, which wasn't a smart thing to do, given that there were lots of wolves at the door, lots of invaders coming from different areas. So the two factors that I just mentioned actually combined to make for extremely difficult times for the Franks and other European or Germanic groups during this period and beyond. The two families aforementioned were the Merovingians and the Carolingians. And yes, that's a mouthful, and they sound kind of alike. They both come from sort of names within that. Merovich was one of the leaders of the Merovingian family, and Charles, Carolus is the Latin for Charles. So that means kind of the Charleses. The Meroviches for the other one. So the Merovingian family, the Carolingian family, the Merovingian kings, family tree you can see on the right. So they ruled for quite a while, but were eventually overtaken by their allies and for a time loyal assistants and subordinates, the Carolingian family. But it's those two family dynasties connected together, first the Merovingians and the Carolingians, that make up the Frankish Empire as a whole. At first, with the Merovingian family, putting one king after another on the Frankish throne by hereditary, succession, eldest son becomes the next king. The prime ministers, so to speak, of these kings became known as the mayors of the palace. So this is kind of like the politician that's at the right hand of the king, often doing the policy work and paperwork and making of laws for him. And over time, one particular family not only dominated the mayor of the palace seat, but eventually got permission by law to turn it into a hereditary monarchy or hereditary, position to bequeath. It'd be like if our Secretary of State or Defense, instead of coming and going with each president, one is out, another one's in, if they got the right to hand down the Secretary of State job to their son or daughter and keep it in the family ever after. Again, bizarre by our standards today, but this wasn't uncommon at the time in Europe and other parts of the world. And so this family that had served the kings, the Merovingian kings, extremely well as mayors for so long, eventually start to think something needs to be done. Why? Because the quality of the Merovingian leadership started to decline over time. The founder, Clovis, and some of the early Merovingian kings were effective, but increasingly they were not. There were also problems with the succession, as you can see in the picture on the right. Sometimes the king would die and his eldest son would be a kid. And kids can't make the decisions for a kingdom for obvious reasons. So they'd have to bring in someone to rule in his stead for him. But it was always awkward because anytime potential opponents who want the throne for themselves, the crown for themselves, see a little kid on the throne as an opportunity. So I can challenge this. It's a kind of an unstable moment in the kingdom's history, and I can take advantage of it. So with so many of these sort of destabilizing events taking place in the quality of leadership in one way or another, the mayors of the palace eventually decide, you know what, we're the ones making all the decisions. We're the ones sort of doing everything that makes this kingdom go. We're doing all the work. We have the brains. The kings are just not doing anything. We should be running this country. And indeed, they made a bid to do exactly that. First, securing the support of the Pope in the Catholic Church in Rome, which was a wise move, because Clovis, the first of the Merovingian kings, had converted to Christianity and had the blessing of the church. So the Carolingians, while they were still mayors working for the Merovingians, they secretly treated with the Pope, the cardinals in Rome, and sort of secured their blessing ahead of time, which meant that the Catholic Church turned on the Merovingian family and basically handed their support behind the Carolingians. But that's not that's just how things work, of course, because the Catholic Church is going to go with support whichever king gives them the best deal. They want a more powerful monarchy on their side as opposed to a less powerful. So it was really kind of a no-brainer. The Merovingians had offered ineffectual leadership for some time now. The Carolingians were go-getters, so we're going to throw our support behind them. And with that, the Carolingians stepped in, pulled off a coup. The first king from that family was anointed by an emissary of the Pope with the holy oil, which means the Catholic Church and ostensibly God now recognize you as the legitimate ruler of the Frankish kingdom. We skip ahead a bit now to the height of the Frankish Empire, which is surely here in the reign of Charlemagne, one of the most famous kings in European history and one of the greats. He's called that for good reason, though kings love to be called the great. It's nice propaganda piece for them. But Charlemagne looms large in history. His reign is usually seen to be the beginning of the Holy Roman Empire. Not everybody sees it as its beginning as that far back, but it's pretty common to see it this way. He became known as Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, for very good reasons. His long reign changed the face of Europe politically and culturally, and he himself would remain fixed in the minds of the people of the Middle Ages as the ideal king. In more recent times, many historians have taken his reign to be the beginning of the Middle Ages proper. So he's kind of a watershed moment in one person in European history. Some historians see this is the moment the true Middle Ages began, and going way back, he's been was seen at the time as the ideal king. Now, was he the ideal king? Probably not, but the evidence we have, which is somewhat incomplete, does indicate that he was a good king, an effective leader. So he probably was a good model to follow, but not as perfect as many at the time probably thought and made him out to be. One of the most able and now well-known advisors to Charlemagne was an English monk named Alcuin, and we're not sure how they came together. It appears likely that Alcuin was on a trip to the south of France, maybe Italy, and they run into each other, or the king heard about who this guy was. But at any rate, Charlemagne wanted to talk to him and was so impressed with his learning that he asked Alcuin to come and live with him and be one of his advisors and administrators in his government, in the Carolingian Frankish dynasty. And Alcuin, by the way, it might sound strange at first that a monk would be tapped to come aboard and be basically the major political leader, political guru for a king. But there are no universities in Europe yet, and oftentimes the only literate and educated people in a community were the monks. So in a sense, if you're studying the Middle Ages in Europe, when you see the word monk, you kind of substitute it for like professor. They had kind of the same kind of status. Not all monks were intellectual types, but many of them were. And almost all the intellectuals in Europe were monks. So Norman Cantor, again, says, in the bleakness of the damp northern clime, Charlemagne's capital was at Aachen, kind of northwest Germany, kind of right near the Low Countries, near the border. But in the bleakness of the damp northern clime, through the freezing cold of long dark winter days, warmed only by fickle and uneven rays from a wood-burning fireplace, the monks in their heavy cowls and wooden clogs sat on long wooden benches and inscribed Latin while the texts were read to them, or they painstakingly and expensively illuminated initial letters and whole pages on parchment. Their eyes red and throats parched from the smoke of the candles, the scholars and scribes pursued their assigned tasks of writing and reading under the shrewd leadership and stern discipline of the head of the palace school, the Englishman Alcuin. So in many ways, Alcuin was sort of the overall sort of cultural minister, or the minister of cultural affairs for Charlemagne. He presided over, as a whole, to the extent that it was guided at all, the Carolingian Renaissance. You can see here, which had elements of artistic creativity to it, but more than anything else, it was probably a curriculum of learning. And that heavily valued and prized literacy. Hence, Alcuin, a monk, and he inviting many other monks to work on this project, an intellectual/cultural one. And the part of the project talked about in the quote here were the scriptoriums, or scriptorium. In Aachen, there was a room where monks, like all day long, but candlelight, because the buildings weren't very well ventilated, didn't have many windows, but they would just copy written manuscripts, religious things, classics, because there were no copy machines, no Xerox machines in those days. So if you wanted to copy even one copy of one book, it had to be laboriously, painstakingly copied by someone, and most likely a monk, because they can read what they're copying and see if they make a mistake, etc. And on the right, you see an example of not just one of these copied manuscripts, but an illuminated manuscript. And these are beautiful. If you get a chance to see some of these originals like this in museums, they're incredible to look. So the artwork is phenomenal. This is just a way to kind of spice up the beginning of each chapter or section of a book by having, not every page is like this, but having certain pages with that kind of decorative art around it. And the closest place, by the way, to see this would be the Getty Museum in Los Angeles, which has actually quite an array of things that look just like this, and originals, of course, at that. So Alcuin presided over the Carolingian Renaissance, possibly Charlemagne's most important advisor on cultural and other issues as well. Eventually, he left and went back home to England. I don't think he had a falling out with Charlemagne, but he sort of figured, my time is done, and I want to move on to something else. And a remarkable figure, however, in European and world history. Speaking of remarkable figures in world history, we now get to Saint Benedict, an Italian monk himself, and became kind of the quintessential monk. In fact, the rule of Saint Benedict, his set of rules for how monks should behave, became the standard for monks, not just of his persuasion, the Benedictine persuasion, named after him, of course, but of all the others as well, Cistercian Monks, Franciscans, and Augustinians, and on and on and on. So the rule of Saint Benedict became the central way to organize a monastery, right? The building that monks live in and work in and pray in, and relative isolation. But there's a strange thing that happens here. Monks generally join a monastery for their own purposes. They're trying to get in touch, closer touch with God, to save their soul and to understand God if they can, if that's even possible. But the point is that they didn't usually become monks and go and live in monasteries to help the society, to help the poor. There are some monastic groups that did do that. The friars were more apt to plan going out into the community, helping the poor, and doing all kinds of good work as part of their actual plans and rules. But most of the monastic groups, taking their cue from Saint Benedict and the Benedictines, they were there for their own purposes. Now, they worked together at the monastery, but that was mainly so that they could all survive and pitch in to create and cook food and clean and etc. But they're there mainly still for selfish reasons. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just setting up kind of an irony, because a lot of these guys were lured back out of the monasteries, sometimes pretty quickly, because the society the outside society, right, knocks on the monastery door, and a monastery is designed to be pretty cloistered, designed to kind of keep the walls around you, thick. And so if you're a monk, you'll be left alone to contemplate, God. But the European society keeps knocking and knocking and knocking. Why? Well, we already know. It's because the monks are, the most educated in, kingdom after kingdom. So kings and princes, archbishops in the Catholic Church need secretaries, need advisors, need lawyers to draw up legal documents and deal with negotiations with other parts of the world. And so who do they come to? The educated class. Right? The monks are kind of the medieval equivalents of guys with PhDs, at least in the early Middle Ages. So the world is knocking at the door saying, hello, Mr. Monk, I know you want to just contemplate God all day, but we need you out here. And many monks said no, and were too committed to the simple life, that ascetic life that monks lead. But some of them did get coaxed out. The temptation was great. You'd make a lot of money, probably become powerful, maybe even famous. So this was a pressure working against the monastery's original purpose. The rule of Saint Benedict is seen today, from our vantage point, as quite harsh. There were times you had to sort of have an enforced silence for long periods of time. You had to work incessantly, pray many times a day, have very few comforts, etc. At least that was the rule. And Benedict enforced it pretty heavily. Later, copycat monastic groups, like the Cistercians, oftentimes started with this kind of Benedictine purity and sticking to the letter as well as the spirit of the law, but would sort of drift over time. And the Benedictines themselves drifted kind of away from the original rule for a time. But this was then a rule book, actually literally, as you see on the left, for the organization, governance, and behavior of monks in a monastery, so that they stayed kind of on a schedule, that things stayed sort of coherent in a rigid sort of way, not necessarily a bad rigid way, but that there was stability in everything. Pope Gregory I, one of the great popes in the whole history of the papacy, but of course comes early on. Thomas Bokencutter's History of the Catholic Church states simply that he was a man of true genius, profound spirituality, and unflagging energy, and that he gave the papacy a direction it was to follow throughout the Middle Ages. And boy, is that true. 4 great achievements. There were others, but these stand out. He basically established the popes as the rulers of central Italy. The popes don't have that power any longer, but from Gregory's time on until fairly recent times into the modern world, popes weren't just religious/spiritual leaders, they were temporal leaders as well. The papal states was one of the city-states of Rome, like Venice and Florence, and its ruler was the Pope. So he was a king, in a sense, as well as the Pope. It's Gregory that established that. Gregory also strengthened papal primacy over churches throughout the West. You could say that it's Gregory the first that made the Pope into the Pope that we now know. It hadn't before been entirely clear, though it had been moving in that direction somewhat, that it was the Bishop of Rome, this position, that was the most important one in the Catholic Church. Before, there were a number of bishops and archbishops, and none of them had necessarily power over the others. But Gregory sort of takes the power and moves it to Rome, and that's been seen as the See of St. Peter ever since. Part of the rationale for doing it is a passage in the Bible that refers to Peter. Third, he successfully converted many peoples in Europe. The Germans, for instance, the English, not necessarily personally, but some of his emissaries, one of whom is famous, went out and first converted the English and the Germans and other groups, proselytizing missionary work. Also, he left a large body of writings that greatly influenced Catholic thought and theology and doctrine. So Gregory the Great is one of the greats. We now get to what's, I think, the most well-known part of at least Western Europe in the early Middle Ages, and that is the rise of feudalism. Those who work, those who fight, those who pray. The rise of feudalism. In a really good book, not on the Middle Ages as a whole, but with a section on it. Robert Wright says, feudal, the word, is today a pejorative term, negative term, but feudalism was in some ways well suited to a time of instability. Like the classic chiefdom, it kept food on the table without relying on a sound currency or on trade with distant peoples. It also kept warriors at the ready. This is especially impressive because equipping warriors got expensive. It was almost as if today no soldier could safely set foot on the battlefield without his own personal tank. The solution to this financial challenge, giving knights lordship over chunks of property they could subdivide for the use of peasants, worked well enough, and making each lord a governor of his immediate subordinates, not just peasants, but any other vassals, made for a decentralized government, a handy thing in a time of poor roads, low literacy rates, and other barriers to distant administration. Its long chain of mutual obligation gave the system a kind of resilience. Each link in the chain was a simple and direct, non-zero-sum relationship. A lord and his vassal both benefited from the deal and had consecrated this interdependence with ornate oaths of devotion, like the knighting ceremony you've seen in movies. So if for any reason the bonds at the highest level broke down, the lower levels of hierarchy tended to stay intact out of mutual self-interest. When kingdoms collapsed, they broke up into regional or local polities, not into anarchy. And all this came about not as a plan. Right? This kind of thing, if they had tried to plan this, it probably would have failed. Human beings aren't that great at planning, at least on a massive scale, what we call social engineering. This was a makeshift emergency response to threat. Outside foreign threat. 3 different ones. They're coming out at the same time. The Vikings, or Norse from the north, who I'm sure you know something about. The Muslim forces from the south, who had gotten into Spain by this time and were ensconced there, got as far as the middle of France before turned back at a place called Tours by Charles Martel, one of the Carolingian family. Charles Martel's nicknamed the Hammer. He's famous because he turned the Muslim advance back. And there were groups of invaders from the east, Eastern Europe, Magyars, and all 3 of those groups, plus the fact that the Frankish kingdom basically was on the verge of collapse anyway, led to feudalism kicking in when the Frankish kingdom could no longer protect the borders and basically collapsed. So what the quote here is saying from Robert Wright is that the feudal system, as it developed, not through anyone's, again, plan, but it ended up being beautiful because if you have a pyramid of power and the guy or whoever the top part of the pyramid represents gets knocked off, you still have a structure of hierarchy in place. And so now the second to highest group or piece there, they now make the decisions, and everybody sort of beneath them has to fall into line. So this was the feudal system, certainly hierarchical in terms of wealth and power, and it came about as a makeshift response to emergency conditions, as not only were Europeans being, especially in France, being invaded by outside entities left and right, but they just had sort of no ability to fend this off, and so they fell back on themselves. So when the centralized power of kings broke down, like the King of France, and by the way, through the feudal period, which lasted about 300 years overall, the kings are still running around saying, hey, follow me, I'm the king. But the lords, the dukes, the nobility, the main leaders that are defying this, are saying, no, we're going to stay as a regional kingdom with me, the Duke of Normandy, at the head. Why? Because, well, you've already proven you're unreliable. You can't defend against Viking raids, and you can't do this or that. So we'll just fall back on ourselves. We'll have, less borders to defend because we're now a smaller unit. but we're kind of like in a comfortable safety cocoon here, so we're not listening to you unless you can force us to. And the kings just didn't usually have enough power in Europe at the time to force everybody that was trying to drop out and form, their own kind of localized, regionalized, decentralized system from doing so. And it worked in many ways remarkably well. So first and foremost, the feudal system was a political system. This set of, largely informal arrangements that came about through challenge and response and, crisis, had to do something, on the quick to defend Europe against these, various pressures. But there's also sort of social and economic aspects to the feudal period as well. So you see the feudal political, economic, social system. Kings were at the top, but if the king was, again, ineffectual, then he's sort of, that piece is taken off, and now the two lords you see there are now the rulers, one of one area, one of another. And there's this whole pyramid of power that gets quite complicated because the charts, like this one, make it quite simple. There's king, lord, knights, peasant. But in fact, there were many sort of layers of knights and lords. So, but everything boiled down to what your relationship was to those above and below you, what the expectations were of society in that regard, and what your position was with regard to the land. In those days, wealth was land. The marker of wealth, what decided whether you were wealthy or not, was how much land you owned. So the kings, of course, if the king is functioning as king, his approach to the land, or his position vis-a-vis the land, is ownership. But when the king is gone, as he often is, at least not ruling during the feudal period, there are regional lords. So it's lords that are making the decisions, and they own the land. But they give land to vassals and knights for, in return, loyalty and service, both politically and militarily. And so this is the zero-sum, mutually reinforcing relationship, reciprocal altruism. So the lord needs help holding his region together as the titular ruler here. There are no formal armies at this time, professional, full-time armies. So when the duchy is about to get invaded, the Duke of Normandy goes to all of his sub-lords, vassals, and says, bring your guys, get your knights together, get your peasants, and schlep all the gear, and show up in my palace or castle, because we're going to have to fight this group off. And so what the lords get in return for that is a healthy chunk of territory, or more, if they do long-term service to the king. Knights are kind of middle of the road noblemen, or lower noblemen, but there's a lot of places in between. So somebody could be like sort of in between lord and knight, and they'd be a vassal to the lord, right, and a lord to the knight. That's how complicated this can get. Historians sometimes call sub-infeudation. Nice, unnecessary technical term, but that is what it means. It's more complicated than even just this. So knights and lords get land. Lords get more land. Knights get slightly less because they're not as important as the lord, who's like their commander, their general. What do the peasants get out of this? This is supposed to be a mutually beneficial, non-zero-sum game, beneficial for everybody. Well, I think it's fairly obvious, and it's not inconsiderable. The peasant farmer gets security and safety and stability because he's got the king or lord and knights and vassals looking out for him, not out of love, but their job is to save the kingdom, make it sort of work. So the peasants get protection. They also get a value system over time through the Middle Ages that develops among the upper classes that puts in place an ideal. Remember, an ideal isn't necessarily perfect, or doesn't always bring what it says it's going to, but it's a desire to push in that direction. The feudal ideal the French have had a phrase for this for a long time: noblesse oblige. Nobility obligates. So if you're a member of the nobility, a lord or an earl, a count, you have a responsibility, customary, traditional, sometimes legal, to give back to the poor peasants beneath you, help them, give them resources to rebuild their house if they got blown over in a storm, this kind of thing. So it's in a way kind of a social safety net for the peasants. The lords were there looking out after them. But of course, the peasant had to give something back here as well, and he had to give back work. He did the field work. In wartime, peasants often went along and schlepped and cooked and repaired and did the dull, monotonous, boring work. But even that relationship between peasants and anybody higher than them on the ladder is one of mutual benefit. So this system actually worked pretty well. I think Robert Wright is correct in saying that. The ceremonies were sometimes elaborate. The knighting ceremony you've seen, where the guy kneels down and the king, or whoever the lord is, puts the sword on his shoulders, and then one after another, and then the head. These kind of ceremonies were legally binding, but also customarily and traditionally binding. Mark Bloch, now deceased, one of the great historians on the Middle Ages, one of the greatest of the greats, said, "Imagine two men face to face, one wishing to serve, the other willing or anxious to be served. The former puts his hands together and places them thus joined between the hands of the other man, a plain symbol of submission, the significance of which was sometimes further emphasized by a kneeling posture, served to cement one of the strongest social bonds known in the feudal era." And even beyond that, some of the bonds lasted. Some of the socioeconomic relationships, though not the political here and ways of doing things, lasted for centuries after the political part of the feudal system was gone. At the bottom, I ask, was the oath of homage and fealty or loyalty, was it purely kind of personal, right? Or was this legal? It was a bit of both. So I think there's no way to disentangle that. What was personal was also a legal bond, and vice versa. We now move to the early Middle Ages in Eastern Europe, or almost outside of Europe, in what's known as the Byzantine or Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire that didn't collapse when Rome as a city and the western half of the empire collapsed. This one lived on, and it in many ways carried on the values and had many of the same features as the original Roman Empire because they were part of it. But since this lasts about 1,000 years after the western half of the empire falls, over time it develops a distinctly unique cultural character of its own. So it looks less and less like Rome as time goes by. But there's always certain institutions throughout this Byzantine Empire that are of Roman origin. At its height, in the 11th century, the Byzantine Empire had ruled over every country bordering on the Mediterranean, from Spain and Italy to Egypt and North Africa, as well as controlling the shores of the Black Sea and the upper half of the Red Sea. I forgot to put the author here. The book is called Empire. The author's name is Paul Strathern. So a new book on empires as a whole, a really good one. But this is a vast empire in itself, and it's almost sort of an afterthought today, and as you can see why. We've looked at some pretty mighty kingdoms around, and this one's power was, it certainly was much less than the 1,000 years of its survival. So only in the earliest years, centuries of the Byzantine Empire's rule over much of the Mediterranean world did it really have lots of power. After that, for a couple hundred years, other forces like the Ottoman Turks from outside kept chipping away at the Byzantine Empire, taking more of its territory. And by the time it falls in 1493, it's lost a lot of territory and a lot of power. What the Byzantine Empire is probably most known for, other than the Greco-Roman tradition living on in its eastern half, as it says on the screen, is their contributions to culture, architecture. You see here artwork as a whole. Bentley and Ziegler, our guys, say during the centuries after 200 CE, most of the classical societies faced a series of problems: epidemic disease, declining population, economic contraction, political turmoil, social unrest, and military threats from outside that brought about their collapse. We all know how fun all those things combined can be. Only in the Eastern Mediterranean did a classical empire survive. The eastern half of the Roman Empire, known as the Byzantine, withstood the various problems that brought down other classical societies and survived for almost a millennium after the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. Until the 12th century, the Byzantine Empire was a political and economic powerhouse. I wouldn't go that far ahead, but the empire and its leaders were quite good at being crafty. Even when they weren't as powerful as they had been before, they found ways to kind of stay in the game in terms of competition, competing with the other neighboring powers. The height of the Byzantine Empire came in the incomparable reign of Justinian, incredible leader, most known for reforming the law code and having it written down in a way that, for the most part, copied as much as possible the Roman law from the western half of the empire and the city of Rome itself. The fragments of earlier Roman law came across the mountains and sort of eventually again got to Constantinople, and scholars, legal scholars there, and Justinian, their emperor, started to get interested in this. He was a workaholic of an emperor, sometimes referred to as the sleepless emperor, not because he was an insomniac, but because he was just so energetic and was a workaholic. His wife, Theodora, they together had both come from humble backgrounds. You don't see this very often in the world, this far back, where people that don't come from already rich and socially connected families, rise to the top. But they together brilliantly did just that. And once in power, Justinian put an enormous amount of resources into rebuilding Constantinople. The jewel being the church of Hagia Sophia, which you see on the right. He could have, which is still there today, and one of the most famous, buildings in the world. He codified Roman law, as I already said, not himself, but he, put the project into place and worked on it, systematically, so systematically that it later became the foundation of the legal systems of much of Europe. So what they'd done, the compendium of the body of law, they sent back to Europe again. He built his kingdom. Empire built aqueducts, hospitals, schools. They encountered greater trade and education, encouraged that. So this is kind of the high point, the high water mark, in some ways also the cultural, kind of golden age of the Byzantine Empire as well, early on. Justinian Code, you see here, just to give us a little more detail on this, I'll read Spielvogel's book, or from his book, The Body of Civil Law, a codification of Roman law that became the basis of imperial law in the Eastern Roman Empire until its end in 1453. Since it was written in Latin, it was the last product of Eastern Roman culture to be written in Latin, which was soon replaced by Greek. It was also eventually used in the West, and in fact became the basis for much of the legal system of Europe. That part we've already said. Writing an effective, well thought out, a systematic legal code we've already seen in other parts of the world is, I think, essential for good rule, for good government. So Justinian had the brains, the drive, the good sense to put this project into play, and it paid benefits, not just then, but again for eons thereafter. Justinian, although he was practical in many ways, he was somewhat of a dreamer too, as powerful kings and emperors tended to be in this era, and he sort of got it into his head that he wanted to reunite Rome, under his leadership, of course, which would mean you have to go back into Italy and Western Europe and retake what had already been taken by Germanic tribes, and for the most part still in the hands of one Germanic tribe or another. He got together with his favored and most gifted general Belisarius, you see here, and Belisarius carries out a number of campaigns for him to try to do exactly that, which failed in the end, but they got pretty far into Western Europe. Bentley and Ziegler saying Justinian's most ambitious venture was his effort to reconquer the Western Roman Empire from the Germanic peoples and reestablish Roman authority. Beginning in 533, he sent his brilliant general Belisarius on military campaigns that returned Italy, Sicily, northwestern Africa, and southern Spain to imperial rule. He got all those places back under Roman control, just this time the Eastern Roman Empire was controlling it, not the West, because it didn't exist any longer. By the end of his reign in 565, Justinian had reconstituted a good portion of the classical Roman Empire. So he actually came close to succeeding, believe it or not, in a sense enlarging his own empire and calling it the Roman Empire kind of revived. But things didn't work out for too long after that with the Byzantines on top. The reason that the earlier historian I quoted could say that they were a major player politically, militarily until around 1200 is because of their ability to think strategically, their ability to carry out policy with a great deal of stealth and indirection and nuance, and so they sort of played a mean game. They were an underdog by those years and to their demise in 1453, but they were able to use wit, keen wits about them to keep their empire alive, keep the wolves at bay. In a really good book that means exactly what it says, The Grand Strategy of the Byzantine Empire, Edward Lutwyck says sometimes the empire's military strength was abundant enough to allow it to mount a major offensive that conquered vast tracts of territory. Then diplomacy was mostly employed to extract concessions from the other powers intimidated by Byzantine victories, or at least to keep them from interfering. Sometimes the Byzantine army and navy were so weak, or their enemies so strong, that the very survival of the empire was made possible only by foreign allies successfully recruited long before or just in time. More than once, bands of warriors from nations nearby or remotely suddenly arrived to tip the balance and save the day. In between these extremes, there commonly was a more balanced synergy in which diplomacy, guided by superior information, meaning intelligence, intel, was empowered by capable military forces, while military strength was in turn magnified by well-informed public action. All of that, and some good fortune too, were needed to preserve the Roman Empire of the East because it was inherently less secure than the Roman Empire of the West that it would so greatly outlast. So ironically, this outlasts the Western Empire by 1,000 years, but it didn't have nearly the military muscle and might, but they were quite clever in the way that they took weaknesses and found ways to overcome them or make up for them. But it all came to a crashing halt finally in 1453. The Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Turks, who came from originally Osman, their founder, was a member of a tribe in central Turkey, so not too far away from here. And his empire was created by conquering other tribes around him and then moving outward from there on a binge of conquests. The Ottomans, from this point forward, 1453, for a couple hundred or so years, became one of the major forces, major empires in the Western world. But their coup de grace was the capture of Constantinople, or Istanbul, from the Byzantine Empire in 1453. So they'd been on the rise for a long time. The Ottomans, one of the first militaries to use artillery, cannons successfully. They battered down some of the walls in what was believed to be an impregnable fortress around Constantinople before this, but they breached the walls partly with use of cannon. They didn't invent it, but they utilized it, improved it, put a lot of resources into cannons. About 80,000 troops under Mehmet II laid siege to the city. Cannons sometimes had 26-foot-long barrels that could launch balls weighing 1,200 pounds. By the way, in those days, cannons didn't fire exploding shells. They just shot very heavy, like iron balls. Well, okay, if it doesn't explode, what damage can it do? Well, not only can it knock down walls, but if it like hits the ground, right, it still can send up shrapnel because it's such a heavy, piece of metal that it hits, like, say, stone or whatever, and stuff's gonna fly out all over the place. So there's still shrapnel, and sometimes the balls just kind of keep going like a bowling ball going through pins. So from the beginning, cannons used a large scale, if used the right way, were extremely effective in warfare, which would of course only become more true over the succeeding centuries. They dragged ships overland to go around the famous chains across the Golden Horn. Another way that the Byzantines were quite crafty in things military is they put lines across certain parts of the channel, in the straits that their city looked out over. So it was notoriously difficult waters to maneuver in, all kinds of eddies and changes of currents here and there, but with also a chain kind of across as well, that made it even more difficult. It's hard to attack by sea. But the last Byzantine Empire was killed during the siege in the final battle, and in 1453, what had been unthinkable for a long time happened, and that is that the Constantinople collapses and the entire Byzantine Empire collapses as well. Lastly, the Byzantine impact on the West. The Byzantine Empire, Byzantium as they sometimes call it, was a hub of information exchange. And it did kind of three things of great historical significance, not necessarily intentionally. One, it inadvertently helped defend Western Europe from outside invasion, at least coming from that part of the world. So the Muslim forces coming from the Ottoman Empire, the Byzantine Empire was kind of a screen, right? It was kind of a buffer zone. And so they ended up, whether they wanted to or not, they ended up helping Western Europe to fend off Muslim forces. Importantly as well, the Byzantine Empire also stimulated learning in the West and in Islam. The Muslims, as we've already seen, have had a lot of documents and original texts from the ancient Greeks and even Romans as well, and so did the Byzantine Empire. So it's largely Islam and Byzantium that keep Greek and Roman thought alive at all, because they have most of the copies themselves, and some copies of certain books that no one in the West had, no one in Italy or France or England or Germany had, and they weren't sure if it was even real. We talked about in the sources, but that we're not sure it even exists or ever did. But once the Europeans came into contact more and more with Islam and the Byzantine Empire, they realized, wow, these guys have copies of all kinds of books written by Aristotle and Plato, and some of them we'd never heard of before, or heard of but didn't know that even they existed. So there was a degree of cultural and especially intellectual sophistication at the height of the Byzantine Empire, actually even beyond in that case. It's only politically that it went into decline fairly early, not necessarily culturally. The Byzantines carried the torch of civilization, as one author says, unextinguished at a time when the barbarous Germans and Slav tribes had reduced much of Europe to near chaos, and they maintained this high degree of civilization until Western Europe gradually emerged and began to take form. So he's saying that the Byzantine Empire was kind of a nice bridge that kept Roman and later European culture, law, and other things alive to be used later on once Europe kind of forms its own sort of powerful kind of and distinct, carves out its various countries and territories. So also the Justinian Code was of huge importance in it was Byzantine Empire that wrote it and bequeathed it to later generations. There are still some countries in Europe today that in some ways are still based on the Justinian Code written that many centuries ago. There are other ways in which Byzantium was important, the Byzantine Empire was important, but we don't have time, nor I think the inclination to go any further than here. This will do it.